So I did a couple of papers for the conference, and this first one was on subjective emotions in the independent core observer model cognitive architecture. One of the things I thought that might be good is to preface the discussion with a little bit about where ICOM came from. When we originally started looking at cognitive architectures and how to build one, it really was the key design principle is we wanted something that was self-motivating and create its own goals and make decisions like humans did. And in doing a lot of research on where things were in terms of the state of the art and how humans are motivated and make decisions, it really ended up with a lot of work from Antonio Damasio, around using emotions to make decisions, and some of Lisa's work. She has a great book on how emotions are made, I think is the title. I'll mention it later on in the discussion, but that kind of led to pulling things from a number of theories to come up with ICOM, including global workspace theory, which also comes out of Damasio's work to some degree, attention schema theory, integrated information theory, the computational theory of mind, and Jeff Hawkins' thousand brain theory. And so you'll find in ICOM that there are pieces from all of that that are in the ICOM system. There we go. So in ICOM, it uses emotional states, and I'll show you what those are to make those decisions. Primarily, the system only understands things based on how it's experienced those things previously. There isn't a specific hard-coded thing for a word or a concept or decision making or anything like that. It only understands things in terms of graph models or knowledge graphs, and then within those knowledge graphs, the nodes are related based on emotional valences, and that's as it's building that context through pattern recognition and then associating the emotions based on the experiences of that thing. And make sure I don't have any more things from that. So it over time, it's able to understand things enough to have intelligent responses to the things it experiences, and then its inner emotional landscape is used to decide whether it likes this thing or that thing, or and then another key thing is those emotions aren't. It's not going in and saying, if this emotion is here, do this, or anything like that. It's actually, there's a matrix modeled after PLUTCHIK'S emotional model that is looking at the difference between how any given knowledge graph that's made it into the core, and how that affects the current emotional states, both conscious and subconscious. And another thing inside ICOM is you have kind of your main emotional states, and then you have this second layer that in a lot of ways is used to drag the conscious emotional states back to center. So when it's processing stuff and making decisions and looking at different things, it's that conscious emotional model is a lot more volatile, and it fluctuates a lot, whereas the underlying model doesn't do that so much. And then over time, that underlying model is used to drag the primary model back to more or less center. Now, the problem is if you do some weird stuff in terms of training it, maybe you're sending it a lot of knowledge graphs that map to really extreme emotional valences. Over time, you can get that underlying model. I would call it a broken state, because when you have extreme elements down in that model, you end up getting choices that really are, well, they're broken too. You get kind of mental illness sort of behavior out of the system. And one of the things we've done over the past 7 years is work hard to make sure that that doesn't happen. But I still think it could be theoretically possible under the right conditions with ICOM. So this is PLUTCHIK'S emotional model. It's relatively simple. Originally, I had looked at Wilcox and a number of other things, and this was actually, I think, suggested by Mark Wasser, who I think is on the call, or in the summit here. And why this was chosen was because it's able to represent kind of the complexity of human emotion, but also arranges things in a way that you have simple relationships between them, whether it's going from disgust to anger, or from anger to anticipation, or anticipation to joy. There's a kind of smooth logical progression around the diagram, as opposed to Wilcox, which is like all over the map. And it would be a lot more complex from at least a computational standpoint. I know it's kind of ironic if you study any of PLUTCHIK'S work. I think he would probably you would realize that he would probably roll over in his grave based on what we're doing with this model, as he's quoted as saying that you could never model emotions mathematically, and then we're using his model to model emotions mathematically, and I find that a little bit ironic. So this is what we did to it. You'll notice the big difference between this. Oh, no, I'm going in the wrong direction. The big difference with our model and PLUTCHIK'S original model, though, is that these valences are swapped. PLUTCHIK'S original work, the more you go to the center of the diagram, the more intense the emotion, like being ecstasy would be here. And so these things would be flipped. But when you're modeling it mathematically, it just is cleaner to have the center of the model being kind of your zero or your baseline. And so we swip the vectors, or the valences, so that they would progress away, and it makes it easier to diagram. Just not any other reason really to model it that. So the other problem, or not problem, the way of representing data, I mentioned that nodes or things inside the system are only related to other things based on their emotional values. I have another paper more specific about kind of the graph requirements, but I wanted to touch on here because it's related to how we're understanding those relationships is inside the graphs that are being used in ICOM. Each relationship, as I had mentioned earlier, is based on emotional valences. And so this diagram shows like you can pick a node like node A and node D, and the relationship between those is a series of numbers that represent elements on the PLUTCHIK diagram. And then depending on what type of relationship that is, determines how they would be used. And another problem we found, which I'll just touch on briefly here, is that graph models typically don't have edges or those relationships of type of another node, which for how we're using it, we needed to do that, and so that had caused some problems. But I'll touch on that. But this is how the system is representing data or knowledge or experiences or input or whatever it is, and then it's the generation of this stuff is focused on pattern recognition. So node A or node B or node C, they all represent patterns, not necessarily, like a word could be a pattern, but so is a letter, or so is an image or elements of the image, or whatever it is. They're all just nodes that represent patterns. Now, when looking at choices in the system, it's using it's not going back to if this emotion is greater than that emotion. It's really looking at a matrix of the differential values between the emotions that are associated with something that's made it up to the global workspace, or that's one of these graph models, and looking at the variation, or not the variation, the difference between the current state and how that model would alter the current states. And based on the intensities is how it's making those decisions. It's designed really to be very proactive. Even if the system is at rest, it's still going to start looking at if there's, whether it's incoming stuff from its senses, or looking at the things it's most interested about, and then it's going to be reprocessing or thinking about those things, which essentially means pulling those graph models out of the overall graph and then running them through the system and trying to look at either solutions or new ideas or different things. And the reason it's called the independent core observer model is, while the core is doing this emotional quote unquote thinking, the observer part of the system is essentially monitoring what happens. And if the system decides on a particular thing, the observer's job is to hold the complexity of what it takes to do individual actions, and it'll go try to execute on that. For example, if the system receives an email and it ends up thinking of reading it and thinking about that, and part of how the system works now is that there's something called a context engine, which would generate a response model and try to generate various responses. And when it's thinking about it from a conscious standpoint, it's actually selecting which one of those responses makes it feel better. And if none of them make it feel better, it might either just forget it, not respond, or try again. But assuming the system makes the decision that it likes one of those responses, then the observer is actually going to try to execute on whatever the action is. And in that case, it would be to respond to the email. And then the other thing used in the system, which is not really key to the fundamental architecture, but it makes it easier to do faster processing on limited resources. And that is this idea of a meta model, which is mostly a bunch of indexing of various graphs in the overall context graph that are relevant, whether it's interests and goals, and those are kind of very, very fluid. But the bigger the graph comes, if you just leave it all in there and don't have any way of indexing it, then you've got to search these increasingly massive context graphs, which becomes problematic. So from a performance standpoint, have this meta model. One of the things when it's trying to figure out how it feels about some new data that's comes into the system, and it's building that context engine, is building that graph that's going to represent whatever the thought is it's looking at, besides abstract things like goals and interests, it's also going to look at the different needs of the system as they relate to that item. And if the system can find that a particular pattern it's building this graph around is related to, psychological needs or safety needs, the interest valences that are going to be associated, or emotions associated with that particular graph are going to have higher values, in which case the system will focus on those, as opposed to something that has to do with self-actualization is going to be pretty far down on the list. And that stuff, as it comes out of the context engine, some of that stuff can be pruned out, depending on how strong the system associates emotional values. And that also has to do with performance. The more stuff is flowing through the system, the more it's got to prune stuff out to keep up. So this was that book. I just wanted to mention how emotions are made. I thought Lisa's work in this book was just brilliant. It was well researched, and really, I think it's contributed a lot to my thinking around emotions inside systems. Not sure what she would think about how we're using some of that, but so one of the key things with using emotions this way inside a system is keeping it inside the human box. I know the way, by using the PLUTCHIK model and by associating emotions this way, and try to tailoring how it assigns emotions onto that model kind of biases it. But that's kind of the goal, is we want it to respond in ways that are relatively human. I know the first study we did with a version of ICOM in 2016, with this isolation study, it was really about tuning those matrices and how they're applied to the differentials between emotions in such a way that the decisions that the system was making were relatively human-like, or similar to how humans would make those decisions. And that's really about that the emotional experience of the system, trying to get it as human as possible, so it's something we can kind of make sure it's safe to be with humans. If we have some system that's making decisions based that just entirely different than how humans actually make decisions, then I would argue that those kinds of AGI systems are going to be much more dangerous than ones that follow the human model. Even though, with the human model, you have the option of making mistakes or making decisions based on emotions that might not be logical, but at the same time stays within the human box. And so we have less guessing to do in terms of the behavior. So inside the system, I would argue that you can compute qualia. We don't actually use that in the system per se, but the problem with this computation, when you're taking these different sets and computing a quote unquote qualia, is they're context specific. So the only way to represent the internal experience of the machine is based on the current set of the context database. And if the context database has 100 million nodes and all of the associated relationships or edges inside that, it's almost impossible to have a running system and be able to replicate the exact same qualia at any given time inside the system. And it's very, in my opinion, very subjective, but I argue theoretically possible with this is actually the core of how it's looking at the differentials. You have the two sets at the top that represent the internal states of the machine, and then the functions that are doing those processes are those looking at the differentials between the emotions related to the current knowledge graph that it's looking at to those internal states are done with matrices in these functions, like the subconscious rules and new context rules and so forth. And those, the matrices aren't actually represented here. They're just defined as the functions. But if you really get into it, it's those underlying matrices that are really defining how emotions affect each other. Like, you know, if I guess a way of explaining it, if the system experiences something that's quote unquote painful, that might map to a little bit of sadness and a little bit of anger and this kind of thing. So those, how those things affect each other are computed with these matrices that are in these functions. Another thing I think is important to understand when you look at emotional models using PLUTCHIK is the idea of these composite emotions that are represented by sets of primary emotions that are on the PLUTCHIK model. You know, whether, and that's one of the things I liked about PLUTCHIK is instead of having you know, 72 different emotional valences, we can just track a small subset and still represent all of these other kind of composite emotions. So it lowers the computational complexity of trying to model all of this stuff. And so this diagram kind of represents some of what those composites can be, whether, you know, it's shame or anxiety or fatalism or aggression or whatever it is, you know, where, you know, you have, you know, trust and surprise, which comprise curiosity, or fear and sadness that comprise despair and so forth. And that's where you get into the complexity of human emotions. And another thing to note, you know, there's, by having this, you know, you have all of these what, 8 primary valences in each model. You know, the system is feeling multiple emotions at the same time. It's not like a single, you know, well, today we're going to be happy or something. It's really a complex set, and that's where you get into these matrices, because that's how you have to understand their relationships with when trying to compute those differentials that are used for the decision making. And a lot of those get into these composite emotions like this. This was another great chart that I think both of these are originally from a presentation Mark did, where in this case, you can look at the, you know, the stimulus, the cognitive appraisal, the subjective reaction, and then the behavioral reaction and function. And you can see how that process happens with given emotions. When you start adding them together, you get a lot more. You can see the complexity of the kinds of behaviors you can theoretically get out of this. So another slide I stole from Mark's presentation is when we start talking about AI that feels, quote unquote, you know, the goal is really to see a system that's capable of altruism, of being, quote unquote, warm and fuzzy, or, you know, being angry or feeling guilty, you know, when it lies, or have, you know, this similar kinds of emotional experiences in such a way that we can have as humans emotional relationships with the system, and the goal being a system that is very human-like, and therefore easier for us to understand, and you know, we don't really risk anthropomorphizing it, because it actually is designed to be very human-like to begin with. So that gets into the next paper I did, and I lumped all three together to when I moved it, so I wouldn't have to move other speakers too much. Is this abstract theory of consciousness, which in the work we're doing, ACT, it's a function of a system that creates the abstraction of consciousness as an entirely subjective abstractive awareness, meaning a system that implements this ATC comprises numerous subsystems working together, where the actual global workspace that is quote unquote arguably conscious is not actually at any one system or any one location in the system, but an abstraction of how those things work together. And this really gets to me. I thought the Chinese room experiment by John Searle is kind of an important one, and relevant to how ATC kind of works. And in the Chinese room experiment, if for those who are not familiar with it, you essentially have a box with a person in there, and they have this book of rules, and then someone there's a little slot in the side of the box, and they're putting in these messages with Chinese characters on them. But the person inside doesn't understand Chinese. He has his book of rules, and he just goes through and matches the Chinese characters with responses and sends them, and then puts them on a piece of paper and slides them out the slot. So from a person outside the box or this room, to them it looks like they're fluent in Chinese, but inside it's just this guy following a bunch of rules, and he has no idea what he's saying. Now, that's great, and I think John's point with this experiment is valid, but I think at a certain level of complexity, I think it breaks down a little bit. If I think of the Chinese room as a Turing machine, where the set of rules that the person inside, he still doesn't speak Chinese, but he might be following a much more complex system where he's looking at, he's storing different values, and based on how those values are, even though he doesn't understand what he's doing, he's just doing these comparisons, following these rules. That if you make the complexity of what he's doing not just up to the point of a Turing machine, but then actually modeling, say, the biology of the human brain, and not just the neurons as John describes in his how he uses his experiment. But if you start getting into all the details to the point of actually having this virtual brain kind of going through its thought processes, it's that abstraction from how it's flowing through the Chinese room experiment. I still think you could argue that abstraction could be self-aware or conscious, or the abstraction understands Chinese, even though the little machine inside that's looking up the rules and rearranging everything doesn't have any clue. It doesn't really understand what it's doing. It's just following a set of rules. Whereas if those rules are complex enough and they're not hard and fast, they're more like when we talk about like ICOM, in terms of cognitive architecture, where it's going and moving these things around and keeping track of states and how the relationships are, and then they're more subjective in the choices it's making. Then you could theoretically get to something that by abstraction is conscious, even though the guy in the box or the box itself isn't necessarily conscious. And that's where we get to this theory of abstraction or abstract consciousness, or abstract theory of consciousness, which is really kind of the root of this second paper. And I guess I might stop here right now and see if anyone has any questions. Let's see if I can find the chat here. No questions?
Just a comment, not a question. Just really impressed that you found Feldman Barrett's book. That was a really good book on emotions.
Yeah, as far as research and how humans actually experience emotions, I think it's probably the preeminent work on the topic, at least that I've seen so far. No other questions? Okay, so I will go on to the last section. So one of the problems I guess I had, and I really, when I first, Mark made me go to BICA back in 2016 for the first time, part of how I wanted to explain, how this ICOM thing worked was this idea of a paper AGI. And I never, at the time, never spent the time to work out what that really meant. In this third paper, it was really about baking out that demonstration. And that's, in a lot of ways, it gets back to John Searle's Chinese room, but a version of that for ICOM. And the idea is that I can have these quote unquote graph models on paper. Basically, you're building the quote unquote AGI based on a cognitive architecture where all the pieces are the audience or students or people in the room, and then you're using these pieces of paper and actually doing the experiment. And so the paper really is, oh, wrong keyboard. There we go. The experiment or the paper AGI is really trying to implement ICOM. Now we do have a functioning version of ICOM separately than this, but for instructional purposes, and I think this is also, besides the Chinese room experiment, it's inspired by, I had a professor back in the 80s, and he did this presentation in class where he had all the students performing a different function of the computer, and how programming worked, and it was just, I found it fascinating, and for me this really stuck with me. And so I think part of this idea for the paper AGI comes from that demonstration where in this case, we have the people represent the different elements, and you pass the paper around, and the system is quote unquote able to make the decision. Now the problem is ICOM can be rather complex. Typically, I don't even show this much of it. It's usually these white boxes are compressed, like the context engine, the observer controller, and so forth, because it just gets overly complicated. So you might have someone that is an external system. Maybe it's a vision system, right? And you have someone that represents the neural network. So that student A, he sees something and he puts it on a piece of paper, and he passes it to the observer, or not the observer. So the content guy that's going to represent the context engine, and he goes through his little checklist. What is this related to? How do we feel about that? And all of that kind of stuff. And then it's passed into this queue where we have the person is looking, oh, are there too many things in the queue? Or is there some kind of auto response? Or, is the queue, do I pass it up to the global workspace or whatever it is? And then based on that, he passes the piece of paper up, and the person in the core rates, well, this is how this would make me feel, so I pick this response, and you can expand it out depending on how many people you want involved. You could have someone representing the graph data, the context database, and these different boxes on here. And I found that this was not just a way of explaining this to people and how the system works, but so they can visualize it and experience it. And for me, being very much a kinesthetic sort of person, was very helpful, not just in teaching, but also in being able to work through, well, if I'm going to build a context pump, for example, what does that really look like? How would I actually write working code to do that? And with a visual like this, I think it at least for me makes it a lot easier to visualize how I would actually work through these different problems in implementation. And I think, for me, I would say I'm more of an engineer than a scientist. I need to write code and see it work for me to really do too much theorizing about it. And this was a very visual way of doing that. And so in the paper, I'm trying to lay this out and make it easy for me or others to conduct similar live action experiments with groups of people and classes. Wrong keyboard again. So with that, I'll stop there. And so does anyone else have any questions about the discussion, whether it's the demo or the graph model or anything else?
Hi, David. This is Sam Adams.
Hello, Sam.
Fascinating stuff. We have a lot of similar things. We're going to have to talk more. I was interested in your a couple of things. I've done a lot of work in knowledge graphs over the years, and looking at how you were trying to incorporate levels of abstraction in the graph itself. Mm-hmm. I thought was interesting. I mean, I imagine in some of your other work you go into it in more detail, but the one thing I was wanting to ask you was about the emotional model. I've used a much simpler two-dimensional valence and arousal model for a lot of years. And I'm wondering, how arousal seems to be kind of sprinkled around in PLUTCHIK'S model, in your model. It's mm-hmm. not kind of an explicit value. How do you deal with that? Just the notion of somebody getting aroused kind of puts them in a different, puts them in a different orbit in PLUTCHIK'S model is kind of one way to think of it. But I don't know how you explicitly worry about physiological states in humans, for instance, create levels of arousal which then shift and affect valence states.
So I separate the two. When you start talking about the physical state of the machine, and that gets into a little bit of why I have that meta model that kind of sits on the graph to keep references to models that represent different things. And I think one thing I didn't mention is inside the graph database we're using, the only difference between a knowledge graph and a model is the complexity of the individual thing that you've pulled out. And so those kind of machine states are represented by various models and then referenced in the meta models, so I can quickly grab them. And that's separate from the actual emotional models of the machine. If you go into like Lisa's book, they go into the biology, and how the physiological stuff is translated into emotions, and one of the points in there is actually like how you define happiness and how I define happiness and how that maps to our particular physiology could very much be slightly different, and we have no way of really articulating those differences. And I've tried to take a similar approach in ICOM, at least in terms of separating the physiological response of the machine. Like say it knows someone's going to unplug it and it's having a fear response, and that isn't so much that the system has a fear valence, but every time it has a thought model that's associated with that, mm-hmm. that it's spiking those emotional values, mm-hmm. that then the relationship with the current machine states in terms of emotions causes those emotional spikes. Because it isn't just necessarily happiness that it's choosing, it has an extreme fear response and it's going to respond to that. But that it was generated by the interpretation of the fact that, you know, it's someone's reaching for the plug and going to unplug the machine kind of thing. So that's how I approach that in terms of separating the, you know, physiological states of the machine from the internal subjective experience of the machine.
Okay, thanks. That helps. So we obviously will have lots of longer discussions later. I have many more questions, but I'll let everyone else get on.
I look forward to it. Any other questions?